I came out of the closet when I was 17 and I joined Gay Liberation in Arizona. I didn't come out to my family until I was 18 because I was afraid they were going to have me lobotomized. But I came out early and hitchhiked up to San Francisco. Well, I didn't know anything about what it meant to be gay. I didn't really, back then, I mean, we're talking the late 1960s, early 1970s, there was very little information, and what information existed was overwhelmingly negative. It talked about homosexuality as a crime or a disease, and my father was a psychologist, so I looked it up in his textbooks at home, and that's when I learned about electroconvulsive shock treatment and prefrontal lobotomies and aversion therapy, all of the horrible torture that was endured by gay men and women during that time. So I was very frightened by the whole thing. I didn't want to be gay. It seemed to me a terrible curse. And then I read about gay liberation in Life magazine, and I read about the Stonewall riots and the movement that was growing all across the country. And prior to that point, I had been planning to kill myself. And after I saw the news, I said, no, I'm not going to kill myself. I'm going to get the hell out of Phoenix instead.
And you went to San Francisco.
Yes, I hitchhiked up to San Francisco in 1972.
Yes.
You know, now that Harvey's been so mythologized, I think it's important to remember that Harvey was an ordinary human being in most respects. He was not a genius. He was certainly not a saint. His life was full of all of the defeats and humiliations and failures that most of us endure in our lives. But he had courage. He was strong. He was honest. He loved his people. He loved his city. And I think it's just extraordinary to look at, you know, the reality of what ordinary men and women can accomplish in our lives. He was very funny, and he was very kind to me, and was probably the first adult to tell me that I had value just as I was, that I didn't need to change. He encouraged me. He got me to cut my hair and stop selling weed and go to City College. And then when I wanted to be a filmmaker, and I made a little Super 8 film, and I showed it to him, and he took me aside when no one could hear, and he said, I'm sorry, but you have absolutely no talent. And he made me change my major to political science. So I ended up going to San Francisco State, and I enrolled in the urban studies program of the political science department and got an internship that he arranged so that I could work with him in City Hall and earn credit. I think Harvey came from the sort of sink or swim school of mentorship. He would say things to me like, oh, by the way, I need 500 people in the streets at 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. Make it happen. Or he'd say, there's a dangerous intersection at the corner of 17th and Douglas. Let's put in a stop sign. And he just was constantly presenting challenges and encouraging me to do it. When I was young, I was extremely shy. I couldn't do public speaking. I was very self-conscious, very shy, and he, more than anybody else, really pushed me to give speeches and talk to the media and that sort of thing, which at the time was really absolutely terrifying. So we're filming this interview today on 18th Street in San Francisco, just a couple of blocks from Castro Street. And I was working in the legislature after Harvey Milk was killed. I went to work in the state assembly. I worked for the health committee. So I was reading everything about public health issues, and that was how I first learned about what we now call HIV/AIDS. That was in the summer of 1981. By the fall of 1985, almost everyone I knew was dead or dying or caring for someone who was dying. So this neighborhood was horribly impacted. I could tell you a story about almost every building on this block, about who died there and how they suffered before they died. by 1985, we'd already lost 1,000 people in this neighborhood. And we would then lose another 1,500 to 2,500 a year for over 10 years until effective treatment became available. So this neighborhood was absolutely devastated by the disease, and everyone was affected one way or another. For me, it just seemed that my friends and I were all going to disappear and that no one would ever even know we lived. And my friends were extraordinarily talented people, very ambitious, and I have no doubt that if they had lived, they would be taking home Pulitzer Prizes and Nobel Prizes, as well as Oscars and Emmys and Tonys. I mean, they were amazing people. I was just so obsessed with the idea that they were going to die and disappear. And in November of 1985, when the death toll hit 1,000, just as we were getting ready for the annual Candlelight March to remember Harvey Milk and George Moscone, and the headline in the paper was 1,000 dead from AIDS. And I remember thinking, you know, if this was a meadow with 1,000 corpses rotting in the sun, then people would get it and they would understand and they would be compelled to respond. But there was no response. Reagan was president. He didn't care. He was just fine with us all dying. And that night at the Candlelight Tribute for Harvey, I had Harvey's old bullhorn, which I still have today. In fact, this week I'm packing it up to go to the Smithsonian to be exhibited for 3 years. So I had Harvey's bullhorn, and I asked people to write down the names of their friends and lovers and neighbors who had died of AIDS. And we carried those signs with us down to Civic Center Plaza and put them on the walls of the Federal Building. And when I looked at that patchwork of names, I thought it looks like some kind of strange quilt. And I thought of my great-grandma back in Bee Ridge, Indiana, and the quilts that she had made that were passed down through the generations. And that was the idea. Well, I think what's very important for people my age to do when we're speaking with our younger people, I think the tendency for people my age is to start lecture or say, well, you should do this or you should do that. And I'm trying not to do that. I'm trying really to listen very carefully. Our young people today face a whole lot of challenges. The ongoing epidemic of crystal meth is a terrible tragedy. Our young people are graduating with degrees of limited value and huge student loan debt. So it's a very difficult time to be young. And I think that what I'm trying to do right now is not to lecture or talk down to young people, but to listen to them and to let them know I love them and that I value them and that they're beautiful. And I do everything I can to raise them up and encourage them and tell them to be bold and sometimes to take some risks. Is this okay with this noise level?
Yeah.
Okay. You know, I have been asked this before, what would I say to Harvey or what would Harvey think? And, you know, it's such a different world. And I think that's extraordinary, the change that I have seen within my lifetime, the change that he saw within his lifetime. And I think Harvey just really wanted to make a difference. And I would love to be able to tell him that he did.
And so did you. Yeah, so
Well,
did you.
thank you. Well, that's a very good question. And when you think about it, even if you say this started before Stonewall, even if you say it started in the 1950s with the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis, or even if you say it began at the end of the 1800s in Germany with Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, it's still an extraordinary amount of change in a very limited period of time. And what has happened between in the last 50 years, from the Stonewall Rebellion to the current time, is really quite extraordinary. I think part of it was that this was a movement that moved forward even when it didn't have leaders. Once it was unleashed, the great power of our movement came from ordinary men and women in their lives, in their daily lives. And so I can't find another example in history of a movement that was fueled by people talking about love and their need for love and their right to love. And that has always been what propelled us. And Harvey taught us this. He said the single most important political act any of us can take is simply to come out and reveal to our families and our coworkers and our congregations and our neighbors who we really are and what we're really about. And so that gave us really an extraordinary amount of power, because everybody, even very shy people or people who don't want to be part of political organizing, move us forward when they come out and live honestly.